Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the fourth video in the Read Aloud series for the new dark paranormal fantasy book, The Violet Curse. For disclaimers and extra information, view the first video in the series. You can find the rest of the videos for this book on YouTube on my channel, 7 Bloodfire Art and Story. For more information about the books and the author, visit 7bloodfire.com and follow me on social media under the handle 7bloodfire. In the previous video, we enjoyed Chapter 1, which was titled Bright Night. We will start this video with a map yet again. The yellow highlight shows the forest outside Crow Post. Remember the disclaimer video that begins the series? Viewer discretion is advised. This chapter is told only from the point of view of Lucas, the thief. He's a twisted piece of work. Chapter 2, Killer. Lucas kept looking over his shoulder into the darkness, where he knew the creatures were waiting to make an appearance. His horse bungled noisily through the underbrush, and he reined her in. "Easy, beastie," he whispered. Her entire frame quivered when he brushed his dirty fingers through her midnight mane. She pulled against the reins and pranced sideways with a nervousness that set his teeth on edge, and the branches ensnared his pack and tore the strap. He caught it before it fell, cursing the volume of the blunder, and he tied it again, loosely, his hands moving with feverish urgency. Again, he looked over his shoulder. He told himself nothing was there. Still, he heard the creatures, just beneath the creaking of the trees and the whispering of the quavering leaves. The sound the beings made rippled just below his threshold for sound. He knew he was imagining them, yet he also imagined the mere thought of them drew them to him. Up the road, the wheels of an old horse-drawn carriage slushed through icy mud and sludge, and the pair of chestnuts sounded their distress. Perhaps he had gone mad, but he fancied they too sensed the tall, shadowy creatures. Lucas slid from the saddle and clicked his tongue, and the stolen horse turned her head to stare at him with wide, unblinking eyes. The whites in them shone brightly in the waning moonlight as her black pupils rolled. She snorted and turned to dance away, and the night swallowed her. He was alone again. When the trees creaked with motion, a chill undulated along the ridges of his spine, and he pulled his hood low over his head to cover the filthy yellow hair that would flag him in the damp, rolling darkness. His fingers clutched the carved bone handle of the chipped, rusted dagger belted to his side, and he crept toward the warm glow that illuminated the woods ahead. Insects of the winged variety were stirred to life by that light, and they fluttered toward it madly, seeking warmth or light, or whatever it was that drew them toward the lanterns. The laughter of an old woman slithered by as he pushed through the whispering foliage, and his aching, gangly frame bent double as he swiped at the spider webs he fumbled through. The forest was full of them. Every few paces, another faintly illuminated web of silver appeared too late to be avoided, and they entrapped him and wrapped about him. Several young arachnids crawled over broken webs and prickling flesh, and he cringed as he brushed them away. He continued to creep after that ominously creaking carriage. For too long, it lingered far enough away that he could only see the yellow light among distant leaves. But he had raced the carriage to a perfect ambush site where he knew the road curved just right, where the thick trunks of dead and dormant trees angled just so. He could hide there, then easily board the wagon as it rolled by. Even now, that flickering yellow glow grew brighter. He couldn't see it in this darkness, but he knew the wagon was the correct one, that there was an insignia painted on the wooden slats that formed the wagon's rigid exterior. It was Black Temple's mark, a black quatrefoil upon which lay the image of a scalpel dripping with blood. The inscription at the bottom always promised mercy and wrath. He contemplated the two aged individuals inside the wagon, considered how to extract the information he needed from them. Lucas drew his blade slowly as the mud sucked at his boots, and he crouched as the carriage approached. He glanced behind him again when he felt the knight's unholy eyes upon him, but he kept himself hidden as the carriage neared. Then he leapt, his hand outstretched. But just as he grabbed the wagon's posterior railing and pulled himself against the back of the cabin, a pale, bony hand jutted out from the lightless, painless window. Luke's heart rose into his throat as he twisted sideways and forced his blade through the opening, just where the man's throat should have been. Just as that pale, bony hand gripped his sleeve to trap him, the hand shook severely at Lucas's assault as a blunted, gurgled cry of surprise touched his ears, too quiet to raise alarm. What a waste, he thought. His blade had struck true, opening a yawning smile whose blood the bony hand now retracted to staunch desperately. Again, Lucas's instinct had saved his own life and doomed another's in the same breath. He released the man's arm. The old woman he had heard earlier now drew a breath to scream as Lucas flung open the door and entered the cabin, his cloak casting a blackness that stretched over her frail form. He saw the gray-blue color of her eyes clearly for a moment as the lantern hanging outside swung near her open window. That moment was all he needed. She was dead before another sound left her throat, and her head fell back and hung out the window, bobbing with the motion of the wagon. The old man's horror was all but muted, like the small mew of a dying kitten. Lucas turned to his prey and pushed him into the corner of the seat, away from the dead wife. He held the chipped blade, its jagged point kissing the soft underside of the man's chin. Just above the bleeding flesh, the man touched desperately. His forearm pressed the backs of the man's hands as he pinned him. "What did you receive from him?" he asked. The grievous, haunted gaze of the old man still lingered on his dead wife. He could not seem to bring himself to look away from his beloved. Lucas snarled, "Old man, I implore you to answer my questions before I cut off her head and let it fall into the mud behind this wagon, separate from her body and lost to the forest, to the worms and scavengers. She is already dead. You are still of use to me." The old man's lips quivered, but little sound came from him. "Mr. Ivan!" Lucas hissed impatiently. The old man's body sagged, and the lantern light that swung back and forth caught the wetness in the crevices beneath his eyes. "Why have you done this? My wife!" "Mr. Ivan, I am going to end your life, and whatever business you still have will remain forever unfinished. Be of use to me, or I will make your death more painful." Lucas dragged the man back to his feet, pinned him against the interior wall of the cabin. "What did you receive from him? And where is he gone? This mission is important to me. That means it is important to you. Do you understand this?" But the old man shut his eyes tightly against his grief, and the quiet sound that came from his lips gurgled with his blood. "Kill me however you will. I will not jeopardize the urgency of our news. I will not give away information that will keep us from saving the child." "Child?" Lucas said, taken aback. "What in the maiden's harem are you talking about? I'm not looking for a child. I'm looking for the defector, Rael. Where has he gone, and what did he give you and your wife to deliver? I know this messenger bore more than words. I cut from him precious little, but it was more than I needed to find you. You are to tell me everything I need to know." The old man convulsed, and a tremor ran through his weakening hands. Red began to stream through his fingers urgently as he slumped further. Lucas had cut too deeply. "Answer me!" he spat quietly. "What did he give you?" Sputtered the old man, most sorrowfully. "Curses, which must be broken before they consume. We must save." Lucas followed the old man's fearful gaze to first the cushions, then to the wall as he held the old man upright. "It's here, isn't it? What the messenger brought to you? Where was Rael going?" He dug the blade deeper and saw a flesh rivulet of liquid black glitter across the dull steel blade. Lucas searched the fading abysses of the old man's eyes, saw his own mad eyes reflected like empty sockets, saw tall, umbral beings behind him, reaching out at the taste of a murder reaching its conclusion. The old man collapsed a moment later and convulsed only once, and his hand, covered in dark liquid ribbons, seemed to reach for his dead wife before it moved no more. Lucas flinched, aghast when he saw aphotic marks crawling across his own flesh as though a ghostly hand were penning the murder upon him. But the marks were gone in the next moment, just as he shook free to wipe them away in fervent madness. Lucas took the ring from the man's bony finger and began rummaging through their clothes urgently. There was nothing else of interest on either person. He gritted his teeth and took a moment to gather himself, and the smell of blood began to mix potently with the musky, aromatic evergreen scent that hovered thickly in the back of his throat. Pine. He loved the smell of it. He didn't even mind the coppery scent of the couple's blood tainting it. Pine smelled of freedom, of home. Lucas took the ring from the man's bony finger and began rummaging through their clothes urgently. There was nothing else of interest on either person. He gritted his teeth and took a moment to gather himself, and the smell of blood began to mix potently with the musky, aromatic evergreen scent that hovered thickly in the back of his throat. Pine. He loved the smell of it. He didn't even mind the coppery scent of the couple's blood tainting it. Pine smelled of freedom, of home. It didn't smell like the cold, lightless cells beneath Five Tower. It didn't bring memories of the hair-raising screams in the dungeons, or of young Iron's ire-tainted sneer always leering down at him as the wicked youth continued what experiments his father before him had turned his back upon. Lucas's dagger ripped through the luggage when the cushions and the boxes forming the seats inside the cushion did not hold what he was looking for. His teeth scraped at his lip, almost drawing blood. He did not have time to search more thoroughly, but given the old man's surprise, he doubted it was hidden well. So where was the item or items in question? Lucas paused when he felt the carriage slowing down, and he looked out the window to glimpse the driver and the heavily armored enforcer. "I've got to hit a tree, Davos. Save the rest of that brandy for me, will you?" said the driver. The reply was a half-hearted grunt, almost the sound a wild boar made as it sniffed about in the brush. "Hand me the reins and just piss over the side of the wagon," Davos spat after a heavy swig. "We've got time to make. We got precious cargo aboard. Have you forgotten Mr. and Mrs. Ivan's haste? The man said not to stop for any reason. They agreed to that homeless haggard's terms because of what he told them about the child. There's a damn good reason to hurry carrying that heavy news." "Oh, shove off," said the driver, "or I'll piss on you, Davos. I've not relieved my bladder, and it's hardly been, 2 hours? What are you, a swaddling of baby flesh all wrapped up in a grown man's clothes? You're pissing on my job to protect these people and what they're carrying, and you're pissing me off with your constant getting in the way of that particular job. So hold it, or I'll just cut off your damn wiener and let you cry about that instead. You lose that, and you'll empty yourself of all the piss you keep holding back every time you take a piss, and then we won't have any more damn problems with your bladder." The driver grunted. "Well, you're a sore one tonight. I'm stopping anyway, Davos. Just you go on and try and stop me." Davos curved in reply as the carriage continued to slow down. The bodies of the old man and the old woman were wet with blood, and Lucas knew that if the lantern outside was lifted to the window, the red would be a blinding marker that the two inside were dead. Lucas jerked the old man down into the seat and then hauled the dead woman on top of him. He adjusted the old man's arms, and then he took the blanket on the opposite seat and covered the quickly, yet cautiously, posed corpses. They looked as if they were sleeping, but for one red smear upon the woman's cheek. He pulled her frazzled, pepper-colored hair forward to make it look as though it had fallen over her oval face. He closed her eyes in the same motion. Lucas himself crouched, his knife drawn, the curtain pulled closed behind him. There was a rapping on the door from above as the carriage rumbled to a rickety halt, and the floorboards lurched beneath his feet one last time. "We're stopping for a moment for Tayron," said Davos. "Give me the word, and I'll tie him up and let the horses drag him to keep him from stopping every other hour. 3 days more at this pace and we'll set foot at Crowpost. I'm sure John and Reed will like to see you sooner than expected. They'll want to know what you've learned and of the one from whom you've learned it. To himself, he snorted. Oh, creepy bastard, that one. Never seen golden eyes. Unlike his. Lucas drew on his recollection of the old couple's voices as he prepared himself to utilize his adept ability to imitate others' rising and falling intonations, pitches, tones, and accents. The old couple's voices were well within its natural range and capability, which ensured the mimicry would be convincing. In Mr. Ivan's deceptively short-tempered drawl, he added a note of exhaustion. "Let us alone to sleep, Davos." In Miss Ivan's sing-song cadence, Lucas added, "The news can wait." To her dead husband, Lucas added one final touch. "Sweetly, draw the curtain, will you?" Lucas pulled the shade on that side of the carriage closed as well, so that neither of the men outside could see him or the blood pooling on the floor inside, and so the crisp breeze would not carry the smell of their deaths out. "All right, sleep well," said the coach driver. "We'll wake you two when we've reached the outpost." Taryn shifted overhead, and he chuckled. "So, that stranger made you uneasy, did he?" he asked Davos. Davos didn't answer right away. "He did," he agreed at last. "Why?" "Will you hurry up and lose your piss already?" The carriage rocked as the driver dismounted, and there was a wet shuffling of leaves and crunching of twigs. One set of footsteps. Not 2. Davis was still seated above. "Looked a bit haggard, though, didn't he?" Taryn asked from the brush. "As if he had seen some terrible things. As if he was running from some terrible things." When Davos did not reply, Taryn's footsteps continued away from them. Lucas slowly, ever so slowly, eased the door behind him open as Davos muttered curses under his breath. One of these men had what Lucas was looking for. He knew it was so. The air was chilled and damp upon Lucas's skin, as though some undead creature breathed down his back. He slithered out of the carriage like a lizard, using all 4 limbs adeptly and causing no sound. He crept over the roof as Davos took another swig from his canteen and then set it down at his side, and Lucas's sweating hands gripped the wooden slats tightly as he prepared himself to kill the man. Davos shifted in his seat as if some extra sense warned him of danger, and he drew his sword, even though Lucas was downwind and had never made a sound. "Why would he suddenly be fine with Taryn's behavior?" whispered Davos. The realization came off his tongue like a slithery hiss. He leaned to the side to call more loudly, his sword hand gripping the pommel tightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Ivan." Lucas cursed under his breath and prayed Davos wouldn't yet realize they were dead, that the enforcer would believe they had already drifted off to sleep. "Taryn!" Davos hissed, knowing Taryn had not heard that half-whispered warning. Davos spun in his seat, but he was too late. The man's dark, dark eyes swam with livid shock as Lucas thrust his blade down into his flesh, just above the collarbone, where the armor did not protect him. The blade broke at the handle as the tip glanced off what felt like bone, likely the enforcer's left scapula, and Davos sank against the carriage. A wintry, pained smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. "What awaits you?" the man sputtered with great effort, as though to curse Lucas. Lucas grabbed Davos's sword and pulled it stealthily on top of the carriage with him. He held the man up, clutching at his mail collar, and he searched through his raiment as Davos began to sag. "Make yourself useful and stand upright," Lucas demanded. "Where is it?" Davos' sneer twisted the jagged scar that ran lengthwise from his chin to his pale left eye. The expression was curiously and bloodily humored, as though already the man knew what was coming to Lucas for such dreadful trespass. "In the molten jaws of hell herself." And then Davos was dead, and Lucas could hardly hold the man up any longer. Davos didn't have anything either, but he had confirmed there was, most certainly, something they were protecting, something being delivered. Even if the enforcer didn't give Lucas any clue where the defector was going, that item had the slightest chance of bringing him back. Lucas bit deeply into the flesh of his own tongue and then kicked the dead man off the carriage. The horses whinnied, startled by the sudden weight that fell upon their hindquarters. He cursed again and ducked. The carriage lurched forward, and he snatched the reins from the post and pulled on them gently. "Davos!" Teheran's voice carried back. The dead man's name slurred on his tongue just a bit. "Hurry up!" Lucas growled in Davos's ugly, impatient tone. "You're pissing away the night already. I'm done waiting for you." "Oh, choke on a bone, Davos," Teheran snapped. "I'll be done when I'm done. You know I can't just be done at the snap of a finger. Prick." Lucas grew impatient as he waited, and he also became more anxious. If Teheran didn't have anything he was looking for, he was going to be vastly angrier. He mulled over his options and then decided waiting put him at a greater risk of being found. The coachman wasn't really that much of a threat compared to the others anyway. He was the smallest man in the group, and he was also the clumsiest, as he often stumbled and dropped things in a drunken stupor. And having pursued these people from Hagenhold in search of the defector, Lucas still thought Teheran was nothing more than a well-employed drunkard. Lucas looked back at the carriage quietly, aware he would need to destroy it, regardless of the results of his search. Make it look like a robbery. He chewed on his cheek nervously, also considering how close the other hunters likely were. There were so many of them that he would not be able to elude them forever. They would keep coming until they caught him and dragged him back to Five Tower. And he couldn't return empty-handed, or his slim shot at freedom would evaporate. If he had nothing to offer, Iron would never deliver on his promise to free him of the tall, wraith-like creatures, and Lucas was so desperate for that freedom that he was willing to kill for it. That slim glimmer of hope was enough for Lucas to shed blood and bare his teeth the way a savage animal would. It made him determined to outhunt the hunters. It made him willing to take bigger risks because he never wanted to see those creatures again. He prayed Teheran had whatever the defector had given to the Ivans. He had to have it. Otherwise, Lucas would have no choice but to retrace his steps to Edentine or Hagenhold. Lucas then decided he had had enough. He stepped onto the road and dropped the disguise on his voice, and he pulled back his hood, no longer worried that he would lose his quarry and be identified later. Filthy yellow hair fell over his eyes, curtaining the scratches and the blood-matted beard, and making him easier to see in the dark. "Every person with you is dead," he said as he approached the brush. "I've come a long way searching for the accursed traitor whose parcel you are carrying. I'm willing to kill as many people as it takes to get to him and what he gave to you." There was the clicking sound of a button being snapped apart as he spoke, the quiet hiss of something being slid out of a leather pocket, a gun cocked. Lucas hadn't expected the man to have a gun. Those weapons were difficult to come by, and even coachmen were not often known to carry them. "A cocky murderer, have we?" said Teheran, sounding suddenly sober. His voice carried quite a bit more bite than before, and Lucas felt suddenly less sure of himself. "All three in my company, you wraith-robed robber. They're dead, are they? That's a mistake you'll be regretting sorely. Your blood will be spilled for theirs, know you that." Lucas cursed his luck. For luck it surely was, even if it wasn't on the better side of it. The sword he had taken from Davos was cold in his hand. It would not protect him from that gun. He heard another twig snap from another part of the forest, but he had no time to contemplate it. He charged toward the shadow he knew was Teheran's smaller form, and at the faintest notion of movement in the darkness about them, he ducked behind a massive oak that stood between them. Thorny vines raked across his bare feet, and branches caught at his hair as he leapt over fallen saplings, and leaves rustled to warn his quarry of his approach. And Lucas ducked and rolled when the faintest glint of silver fluttered across his vision. The sword felt heavy in his hand. and his heartbeat raged against his skull as he slid from tree to hackberry tree to another smaller oak as he darted toward the man. The gunshot was loud, and bark splintered over his shoulder, and then the burned chemical and metal smell of gunpowder and smoke clogged his throat. Tayron's gasping became the first raspy approach of a silence that lasted for the longest moment. Not a bird fluttered awake to flee. Not a breath of wind came to whisper which man would fall. The trees seemed to fold in on themselves with unease. A drop of moisture splashed upon his brow from a leaf that swayed just above his head. It stung where it bled into the wound upon his jaw. Again, the smell of blood invaded his nostrils and dragged his mind back to the hellish halls beneath Five Tower, to the screams and the deaths, and to the blinding light and the stirring shadows that birthed the dark creatures who haunted him still, to the end that would, perhaps, be waiting on him one day, if this day was not to be his last. "Damn," said Tayron. Lucas gripped the wrist of Tayron's gun hand, and with a pained grunt he pulled his sword free of the coachman's flesh. He also yanked Tayron's weapon away and tossed it behind him so the smaller man could not wrestle it back. "You're faster than I expected," rasped Tayron as he sank to his knees. "You realize you'll have the worst kind of death when Reed and John find out what you've done." "Who are these men?" asked Lucas. "Who are Reed and John?" "You're a lazy thief not to know the names," sputtered Tayron. "Should have done your job better. Who sent you anyway? You must be someone's piss-poor puppet to be after a vial of blood. Who's hired you?" "A vial of blood?" Lucas's brow rose. What was special about this blood that these people were delivering? Had Rael found something? Lucas drew instead from Tayron's breast pocket a vial containing a glowing shard of violet glass and a small scroll sealed with a silver feather. The violet shard Lucas dropped with an apprehensive cry. Immediately after, he heard the whispering of those terrible creatures as the sound came again unbidden, and he looked about the two of them into the darkness. His pulse thrummed. The rhythm of his heart beat deeply with his terror. His skin grew clammy, and his hands shook immensely. He coerced a deep breath and stooped. He had to force himself to pick up that dreadful glowing shard. This vial was not the one Tayron had just mentioned. It contained not blood but stone, and cursed stone at that. Hastily, Lucas flung it far from them. He knelt to take cover in the brush when he swore he saw dark, ghostly forms chasing after it. The note he pocketed. "Where did you get that stone?" he snarled into Tayron's ear. When the man did not reply, Lucas put the tip of Davos's sword to his throat. "Where?" "Isn't my business to tell," said Tayron. The man grunted, clutching his wound tighter when Lucas shoved him. He placed his boot on Tayron's back and rested the sword's point against Tayron's thin jerkin. The tip rested just over the ribs, slightly below the scapula. Lucas had just but to lean on it, and the steel would go through cloth, muscle, and bone, and then Tayron's left lung would be drawing in blood, and he'd be spitting it soon after. "Go on and do it, you bleeding coward," said Tayron defiantly, his mouth pressed into the leaves and the dirt. He spat out several curses as the blade slowly sank, as the cloth upon his back began to catch the distant firelight with its wetness. But Tayron began to laugh despite how it must have hurt him to do so. "Every drop will cost you once you're caught," said Tayron. "Blood for the bloodless, shadows for the living. Wrath and mercy are one. Have you never heard the words? Wrath and mercy are painted upon every accursed thing belonging to the temple. And for those who cannot read, the bleeding heart being cut apart by the scalpel painted upon it speaks for itself. They'll send out a warrant to the enforcers to find you and arrest you. The Worry Warren will want your blood too, because the guild will withdraw its aid from this entire part of the map until you're caught or killed. Assassins will hunt you like a dog." Tayren's blood was seeping from his lips now. It had run straight down his chin like an arrow pointing into the earth. It had smeared across the side of his face when he tried to turn his head, and had felt the sword twist fractionally. He tried not to let himself cough at all. Both of them knew the havoc a single cough would commit, what with the blade still biting his flesh. Tayren's next choked, haphazardly whispered promise of recourse caused the blade to advance. "The Weary Warren." Lucas felt his lips draw tight across his teeth when he interrupted. "I don't care whether the common folk will want my blood. I've bigger problems than my popularity. Piss on the Weary Warren. Where is the vial of blood you mentioned?" He held up the unopened letter. "The silver feather marker on this letter means this has much to do with the very man I am after. I saw a box given to the old man in the carriage. Did that hold the vial? Where is that box?" "That box went to Reed. It isn't with us." Tayren huffed. "Reed delivered it a week ago with his brother when they left to Cyan ahead of us." "Do not lie to me. What was given to the Ivans was instructed to remain with the Ivans. The man and woman in your escort were Mr. and Mrs. Ivan. The man wore the Black Temple signet. The people you killed here are not doctors, and that ring is no doctor's signet. It is an emissary's. The signets are similar, but not the same. The Ivans you've murdered are Reed and John's parents, you worthless, war-wishing murder thief," said Tayren. "As I said, what you've done killing them. Oh, what awaits you." Lucas cursed malevolently. "Whore's mother and maiden of the lost!" he shouted. He saw red as his pulse beat furiously at his temple. "What else have you?" he grunted, and he tore through the rest of Tayren's pockets, his hands pulling and ripping at the man's clothes to find anything else. He did not see that a second vial, this one containing a red substance, had toppled into the soil beneath Tayren. "That courier may walk in eternal rot after this, in his afterlife for this deception," said Lucas as he ceased his search and pressed the blade deeply against Tayren's flesh once more. This time it rested against the artery along the foreside of the man's throat. "Not as much as you for these deaths." Lucas slid the razor edge across the fragile skin of Tayren's neck, effectively slicing short the man's gurgled warning. As Tayren writhed upon the ground, clutching at his throat, Lucas retrieved the gun and then backtracked to the wagon and tossed Davos's too large weapon next to his body where it might look as though it had simply fallen from his hand. He grabbed the small bit of gold he found in the wagon from the mud where he had tossed the satchel, took the lantern from its post, and then, with a snarl, he smashed the lantern against the wooden slats fencing in the driver's bench. Fire spread like liquid tongues and began to ooze into the crevices and drip inside and down the sides of the wagon. It did not take long for the dry timbers to blaze on their own, and blaze they did, and with a startling tenacity, too. Lucas stepped back and shielded his eyes from the bright fury that he suspected would be paid unto him twofold one day. His mind raced as he put together a plan to track down the vial and to find the man who had sent it. He needed to know where it was going first. The missive remained rolled up in the confines of his deep pocket. He would be reading that soon. He prayed it held some hint of where to search next. He would figure out why the old man mentioned the child later, too. He would have dismissed the child as merely being some ill son or daughter of someone important, but in context with the vials of the blood and stone, and with the defector's seal, Lucas wasn't sure he liked the way the clues were pulling him. A shrill whistle sprang from the wintry darkness, and Lucas spun about, startled. Next he heard several shouts from up the road and about the forest. Hurriedly he drew his hood back over his head and darted into the trees to escape the horsemen, charging toward the carriage at a full gallop. They were armed, and he knew he would be lucky if he seemed nothing more than a fleeting forest shadow washed away by the flames. Still, he did not linger. They might not have seen him, but he knew it wouldn't be long before they began to track him. Mud as there was, they would know the tracks were fresh, and they would resolve to hunt him down like an animal. What he had done to the old couple, they might gut and skin him like an animal too. He had a long trek ahead of him before he would return to his stolen horse, if the beast hadn't wandered far. But there was a river raging about 2 miles to the south. If the animal had failed to graze in the field, he might still gain a day or two against his pursuers with a brisk swim. Perhaps he would make it to the river before they caught him. Lucas is a little twisted. Periodically through Twitter and Instagram, I will be doing free signed book and signed art print giveaways for fans in the United States. The art is created by yours truly, same as the book itself. To enter the first giveaway, follow me and enter the hashtag TVC1 giveaway, and that's a number 1. My social media handle is 7bloodfire. The first winners will be decided mid-April of 2021, at which time I will make the announcement on my website. Contest details will also be noted on 7bloodfire.com. Don't forget to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up and share it on social media so our Leviathans family can get bigger. Yay! Thank you so much, guys.